had seen Dewey last, he said she had come to him to ask for a ride. And when she got into the rickshaw, he asked where she wanted to go, and she said she did not want to tell him specifically where she was going. Instead, she just wanted him to drive in a particular direction, and she would give him more information about how to get where she wanted to go as they got closer. And so this really intrigued the driver. And so after he began going in this direction, he turned to her again and said, can you tell me anything more about where we're going? This is really weird that you're not giving me any more information. And so finally, Dewey relented, and she told him she was going to see the shaman. A shaman, in simple terms, is someone who uses magic to cure the sick. The driver did think it was odd that this girl was going to see the shaman in the middle of the night and she was being so secretive about it, but after he dropped her off, he hadn't given it much thought until he found out she had died. The police approached the shaman, who was 45-year-old Ahmad Siraji, and they asked him if he had been with Dewey on the night of April 24th. Initially, Siraji said no, he had not been with her, and he had no idea what happened to her. But after police searched his house and found Dewey's belongings inside, Siraji said, okay, I've been lying and I have a confession to make. And he would very nonchalantly tell police that not only had he killed Dewey, he'd also killed dozens of other women the same way and buried them in the sugarcane field. And so the police went out to the field and started looking around, and they found all these mounds of dirt all over the place, and under them were women buried up to their neck. After the excavation was all done, the police believed they found the bodies of 42 different women, but truthfully, that was just a guess. They believed there could be more. During his trial, Siraji explained in detail why he did the things he did. He said back in 1986, so 11 years earlier, he had this vivid dream where his deceased father came to him and instructed him to drink the saliva of 70 women. And if he did that, he would become immortal. When Siraji woke up, he didn't chalk up this experience as just a strange dream. He believed he had just had a real interaction with the spirit of his dead father, and so he decided he would do as he was told. But his father didn't explain to him how he was going to extract the saliva from these 70 women. And so after thinking about it for a couple of days, Siraji decided the most efficient way to do it would be to just kill the women and then forcibly take their saliva. To find his victims, Siraji began telling people in his village that he had supernatural powers, that he was able to grant women specifically everlasting beauty and riches. And many people believed it. And so as this rumor spread not only around his village, but to surrounding areas, lots of women heard about it and came to him and requested his services. He would tell them to come back later that night when it was totally dark and to not tell anyone where they were going. Once they arrived, they would come inside of Siraji's house and they would pay him a fee that was roughly equivalent to $300. And then he would tell them he needed to perform a ritual to give them their beauty and their riches. And so they would leave his house, they would cut through a cemetery, and they would enter into that sugarcane field, and they would walk for a while until Siraji stopped them. And he would hand the woman a shovel, and he would tell her to dig a hole in the ground. And he would assure her this is part of the ritual. And so he would stand there as she dug the hole until it was about waist deep. And then he would tell her to get in the hole and put her hands by her side. If she was at all nervous, he would just reassure her again that this is all part of the ritual, that lots of people have done this before, that it's totally safe. And so she'd get in the hole, she'd put her hands by her side, Siraji would take the shovel and he would fill the hole back in until she was completely immobilized. And then at this point, Siraji would pull out a cable, he would wrap it around their neck, and he would strangle them to death. And then once they were dead, he would pull their body out of the hole, and then he would forcibly extract their saliva. And then after that, he would take the shovel again and dig the hole a little bit deeper, and then he would put the body back inside the hole, making sure their head was still sticking out of the ground. And he would orient them so their face was looking towards his house, because he believed having these women constantly looking at him at all hours of the day gave him more power. He said as for Dewey, when she first came to his house and she had paid that fee, she was worried about leaving and going and doing this ritual. It scared her. And so Siraji told her to wait, and he went into the other room where his wife was, and he told her that, hey, I'm gonna go kill this girl and I need your help. I need you to calm her down. And his wife, who had no idea her husband was a mass murderer, just immediately went along with it. She came back into the room and she assured Dewey that everything was totally fine. They had done this before. It was all going to be perfectly safe. And she even said she would come with them to do this ritual. And so at this, Dewey was much more calm and she agreed to go. And so the trio left the house, they went to the cemetery, out to the field, and then only 2 people came back. Siraji was executed in 2008 by firing squad, and his wife was sentenced to life in prison.
spotted. Attention, reporting the target position. Enemy heavily damaged. Enemy battleship foundered.
I need intelligence data.
Engine boost activated. Enemy destroyer detected. Problem solved, sir. The ship is on fire. Support the allied target. Enemy battleship sunk. All stations, reporting the position of a strategic target.
Requesting support.
I owe you one. Enemy destroyer blown up. Engine boost deactivated.
Around midnight on September 3rd, 1986, Doug Wells and his wife Kristen were pulling onto their street in western Montana when they noticed a camper parked in front of their house. Neither of them recognized the camper, and so when they pulled into their driveway, Doug got out and walked over and looked inside to see if anyone was in there. And there was a man sleeping in the front seat. Doug didn't wake him up. Instead, he went back to his wife, they talked about it, and they decided that this man must have just randomly parked in front of their house, and that most likely the next day he would leave. And so the couple went inside their house and they began getting ready for bed. At some point, Doug rounded up all the trash inside of the house and was going to bring it outside to put into the trash bin. And when he went outside, standing in his front lawn is the same guy who was just sleeping inside of the camper. And so Doug very cautiously goes down the front steps and he yells out to this guy and says, what are you doing here? And immediately the man put his hands up and said he meant no harm. He said his name was Wayne Nance, and he actually worked with Doug's wife, Kristen, at the furniture store in town. Wayne went on to say that he happened to be driving down their street earlier that day, and he spotted someone standing outside one of their windows looking in their house, and he knew it was Kristen's house, and he looked in their driveway, and he saw that Kristen wasn't home, and it looked like nobody was home, and so he decided he would just park out front and try to scare off this person and wait for Kristen to get back. But by the time Kristen got back, he had fallen asleep. Doug was totally caught off guard by this whole situation. The idea that there's this guy on his property talking about another guy that was lurking around his property. And so he asked Wayne, did you see this guy again after that first time you saw him? And Wayne said no, he hadn't, but he didn't have a flashlight. And so maybe if Doug went in the house and got some flashlights, the two of them could walk the property and make sure nobody was there. Doug thanked him for the offer and said, okay, well, why don't you come in the house and I'll go look for those flashlights. And so Doug led the way inside of his house, and as soon as Wayne got in the house and shut the front door behind him, he pulled out a metal pipe he was hiding and smashed Doug over the back of the head. Doug turned around and Wayne hit him again over the face, and before long the two of them were struggling on the ground. Kristen, who was upstairs, heard the commotion, and she came running down the stairs, and she sees at the bottom her husband, who's bleeding profusely from his head. He's covering himself up on the ground, while Wayne, her co-worker, is standing over him, punching and kicking him. Before Kristen could do anything, Wayne noticed her up on the stairs, and he drew a pistol and aimed it at her and told her to come down here and tie up your husband's arms and legs. Kristen, who's in shock, is just hoping this was just a robbery and that they would have their lives spared. And so she does as she's told. She walks down. Wayne throws her some cord, she ties up her husband's arms and legs, and then afterwards, Wayne leads Kristen back upstairs to the bedroom where he ties her up as well. After that, Wayne went back down to the main floor where Doug was still laying on the ground, and he grabbed Doug by the legs and he pulled him down the flight of stairs to the basement where he tied him up to a pole, and then he savagely beat him with the pipe before Wayne pulled out an 8-inch blade and plunged it directly into Doug's chest all the way in. And then when he pulled it out again, Doug slumped over. Wayne went back upstairs all the way to the second floor to check on Kristen, and he saw she had managed to get partially out of her restraints, and she was reaching for the landline, and so he jumped on top of her and managed to restrain her all over again. And then after he was confident in her restraints, he went back downstairs to make sure Doug was dead. When he got down there, he saw Doug was still slouched over in the same position he had left him, and so Wayne assumed Doug must be dead, and Wayne went back upstairs to assault Kristen. But Wayne was wrong. Doug wasn't dead. And after Wayne went upstairs that second time, Doug, despite his horrific head and chest injuries, managed to wriggle out of his restraints and then hobbled over to a workbench where he had a rifle laying out because Doug was actually a gunsmith. And so he took the rifle and he loaded it with the one round he found on the table. And then he walked over to the base of the stairs, he raised his rifle, and he made his way up to the main floor. He didn't come in contact with Wayne, and he looked around the first floor, he didn't see him, and he heard his wife screaming upstairs. And so he made his way to the next set of stairs and began walking up with his rifle raised. At the top of the stairs to the second floor, there was a hallway that ran right and left out of sight. And so as Doug is making his way up, he can hear off to the left, out of view, his wife screaming in the bedroom, and he can hear the sound of very heavy footsteps running down the hall towards the landing where he is. And so Doug positioned himself in the stairwell and he took aim about chest height with his rifle, and he waited for their attacker to show himself. And so as soon as Wayne came flying around the corner with his knife in his hand, Doug just fired one shot that struck him right in the stomach. Wayne fell backwards, totally shocked at what had just happened. He began to stagger, and Doug, meanwhile, turned his rifle around like a baseball bat because he didn't have any more rounds, and he just starts walking down the hall, smashing Wayne, as Wayne continues to stumble and fall and try to run away from Doug. And finally, he gets away from Doug, charges into the bedroom where Kristen is, and he grabs his pistol, and he turns around and he fires 3 shots towards the door where Doug is now standing. And Doug, he's unfazed. One round hits him in the leg, the other two miss. He doesn't care. He just walks up to Wayne and begins bashing his head in with the back of this rifle. He hits him so many times that the buttstock of the rifle explodes and the metal of the rifle bends like an L. And at some point, Wayne drops the gun because he's getting viciously beaten on by Doug and his rifle. And Doug sees that, he grabs the pistol, and he fires the remaining rounds into Wayne's head. Police and paramedics would show up shortly thereafter, and Doug, Kristen, and their attacker Wayne were all rushed to the hospital. Doug and Kristen would make full recoveries. As for Wayne, he would die the following day from his injuries. After the incident, the police investigated Wayne Nance to see who this guy was, and they discovered that almost certainly he had been a serial killer that was connected to at least 6 cold case murders from 1974 to 1986. But because Wayne never confessed to any of these murders before he died, the true number of people he killed is still unknown. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. If you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please secretly use the like button's toothbrush to clean a dog's teeth and then just put the brush back. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. I also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballin Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See you.
Building your online business? Go to Wix.com and set up your store on a single integrated platform. Add products, showcase them dynamically, and seamlessly track your inventory. Accept multiple secure payments, and design your storefront down to the very last detail. Get all the tools you need. Drive more sales with customizable gift cards and flexible product subscriptions. Retain customers with a point-based loyalty program, email automations, and reach millions with sales channel integrations. Complete your setup with a personalized analytics dashboard. Make smart business decisions and shape the next phase of your business. Build, manage, and grow from one place. Go to Wix and launch your online business today.
Every choice, every moment, every accomplishment, they're all part of your unique journey. Honor your legacy, simply and thoughtfully. Call us or visit memorialplanning.com.
Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you're in a very crowded parking lot and you see the like button driving around looking for a spot, flag them down and point to your car suggesting you're going to leave, and then go to your car and stand there fumbling for your keys for a few minutes, and then just walk away. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 1918, during World War I, British soldier Henry Tandy found himself stationed inside of a trench in northern France. By this point, Henry was already considered a war hero, and he would go on to become the most decorated British soldier in World War I. But his awards are not what he is remembered for. On September 28th of that year, after a long day of fighting, Henry was propped up on the edge of his trench, looking out towards the German line. It was dark and quiet, and there was mist in the air, and at some point, Henry noticed a figure way off in the distance walking towards him. Henry instinctively raised his rifle, but he didn't pull the trigger. He wanted to make sure who he was shooting was his enemy, because it could be one of their own men who got wounded and was making his way back to the trench. And so Henry's looking down his gun, staring at the sky, waiting to figure out who he is, and after a few seconds, out of the mist walks a badly wounded German soldier, so it is his enemy, but he wasn't carrying a weapon, and he didn't appear to understand he was walking directly into Henry's sights. Henry aimed his rifle right at this German man's heart, but he didn't pull the trigger, and the man just continued to walk directly towards Henry until he got about 30 meters away, at which point he stopped and looked up and realized his mistake. But instead of trying to run away, he just stood there and stared at Henry, seeming to accept the fact that he was about to die. Now, Henry had shot many men during the war so far, but he just could not bring himself to shoot this unarmed, wounded German who just looked kind of pathetic. And so with Henry's gun still up, he glanced to his left and he glanced to his right to make sure nobody was watching, none of his comrades were going to see this, and then he lowered his gun. And then Henry and this German man just stared at each other for a while until the German man just nodded his thanks, turned around, and wandered back into the mist out of sight. The man Henry had just saved was Adolf Hitler. In the early morning hours of June 10th, 1994, Deborah Hoyt suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. She and her husband were staying with relatives in Sacramento, California, and they were supposed to be there for the next couple of days. But as she was sitting there, she had this overwhelming urge to want to leave right then and there and head back to their home in Lake Tahoe. Because she didn't really know what to make of this overwhelming feeling, she shook her husband awake and told him about it. She thought that maybe something was wrong, and he said, you know what, you probably just had a bad dream and you're kind of waking up still half in your dream. It's not a big deal, just go back to bed. I'm sure everything is totally fine. And in the morning, if you still want to, I'd be happy to leave. And so Deborah said, yeah, you're right. I'm totally overreacting. I'm sure it was just a dream. And she laid back down to try to go back to sleep. But as she laid there, that sense of dread that something was wrong and that she had to leave right now, it was just growing and growing and growing until she just jumped out of the bed. She's just standing in the room and she says to her husband, honey, we got to go right now. I don't know what's wrong, but we got to go right now. And her husband did not want to go. And he said, come on, Deborah, get back in bed. It's not a big deal. But she was adamant. She said, get out of bed. We're leaving right now. And so begrudgingly, her husband said, okay, we'll leave right now. And so the two of them hastily packed up and then went downstairs and left a note for their relatives explaining their absence. And then they got in their car and they drove off. After a little while, the couple reached a very dangerous section of their journey back home. It was called Bullion Bend, and it was a very windy road up in the mountains where one wrong turn and you're going flying down the side of a mountain. After driving through this area for about 15 minutes, they rounded a particularly sharp turn, and as soon as they made the turn and could look down the road, Deborah, who was in the passenger seat, she saw up ahead on the right, off the side of the road several feet, something that was just lying there on the side of the road. She didn't know what it was. She thought it was maybe a bag or some trash or maybe a dead animal. And at first she was just going to dismiss it. But as her husband drove closer and closer to it, the light began to illuminate it, and she looked at it and couldn't really discern what it was until they were right next to it. And she looked out her window and she noticed it was a woman's body, a woman who had no clothes on, who was just lying there totally motionless. And Deborah immediately turns to her husband and says, honey, I just saw a dead woman on the side of the road. And her husband immediately is kind of panicked and doesn't slow down. He just keeps driving and says, hey, should we stop? Should we turn around? I mean, maybe she's not dead. Maybe we can help her. But Deborah at this point is now terrified. And she's saying, no, keep going. Don't go back. I bet it's a trap. Someone probably put her there and they're going to lure us in and they're going to attack us if we try to stop and help her. And so in this kind of chaotic, frenzied reaction that Deborah and her husband are having, they decide that their best course of action is just to drive on and find the next payphone and call the police. And it just so happened that less than a quarter of a mile away was a ranger station with a phone. And so they pull into the parking lot and Deborah calls the police. The police tell her to wait inside of her car and they'll be out in a couple of minutes and they're going to need her to bring them up to where she saw this body. So a couple of minutes goes by, the police show up, and they tell them to drive back up the road, but stop about 200 yards short of where you believe this woman's body is. And so Deborah and her husband, they get back in the car, they drive back up the road where they came from, and right at this point where the road turned very sharply is where Deborah knew on the other side of this turn would be this body. And so they pulled over on the side of the road, the police came up on their side, and they said, yep, right around the corner, you're going to find her lying on the ground on the left side. And so Deborah and her husband are just sitting in the car watching as the police go up, they make that turn, and they kind of disappear out of sight. And then they see their spotlight moving around on the other side of this turn, and so they figure, okay, they're looking for the body. But after several minutes, the police came back down the road, and they stopped next to Deborah's car, and they said, you know what, guys? We didn't see anything up there. There wasn't a body. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary. And Deborah would say to police, I'm not lying. I know what I saw. It was a woman's body right there in front of me. I know it. It's right over there. And they would tell her that we believe you, but we can't do anything because there's nothing up there. And so they told Deborah and her husband to just head home, and they did. After Deborah and her husband took off and were gone, the two responding officers drove back to their police station, and once they were inside, they began speculating about what Deborah might have seen. And as they were talking, another officer came into the station, a guy by the name of Rich Strasser, and he overhears them, and he goes over. He's intrigued, and he asks them, what happened? What did you see? And they explained to him that this woman, Deborah, had spotted a supposed dead woman's body up on Bullion Bend. And as soon as he heard Bullion Bend, Rich remembered that just a couple of days ago, they had received a missing person report of a young woman named Christine Skubish and her young son named Nick, who had gone missing, and the last place they had been seen was up on Bullion Bend. And so Rich wondered if maybe there was a body up there, and maybe it was Christine's. And so the next morning, Rich got up early and he headed out to Bullion Bend. And when he reached the exact spot where Deborah had claimed to have seen this dead woman's body, he found a children's shoe. And so he stopped his car, he got out, he picked the shoe up, and he's looking around and he's looking for anything else that's out of the ordinary, but there's nothing on the road, there's no skid marks, there's no other debris, there's no other clothes, there's nothing. And so he walks over to the guardrail that overlooks this very steep embankment, and he looks down the other side, and at first all he sees is just trees everywhere, but as he's looking, he thinks he sees more clothing farther down the mountain. And so he climbs over the guardrail and he very carefully maneuvers his way down, and after only a couple of seconds he reaches a clearing in the branches and the trees, and he can see down to where the train kind of levels off, and right down there is a smashed up red 4-door sedan. It was the same type of car that Christine Skubish had been driving when she went missing. And so Rich ran down the mountain following debris all the way to this wrecked car. He goes around to the driver's side and he looks inside, and there in the driver's seat is Christine Skubish, and unfortunately she was deceased. And then on the passenger seat is her son, Nicky, and he is alive, but barely. He had gone 5 days without food or water, and doctors would say when Rich found him, he probably only had about 1, maybe 2 hours before he would have died as well. Authorities believe Christine fell asleep at the wheel and she drove off that embankment. Initially, Rich believed Deborah must have seen Christine when she was driving through the mountains and saw that woman on the side of the road. After her accident, Christine must have gotten out of her car and then climbed up that embankment and then laid on the road, hoping someone would see her, and then when no one stopped for her, she went back down to her car where she ultimately died. But according to the coroner, that would have been impossible, because when Christine crashed off the road, she died on impact 5 days before Deborah saw that woman on the side of the road. So it could not have been Christine. To this day, no one knows for sure who or what Deborah saw on the side of the road. But it is objectively true that Rich only investigated Bullion Bend and found Nicky alive because of Deborah's police report about this dead woman on the side of the road. And Deborah was only on that road because she had had this totally weird middle of the night urge to suddenly leave a relative's house and drive up into the mountains, something she had never felt before and didn't really know how to explain. So either this is an extremely strange set of circumstances, or Nicky had a guardian angel. In early 1983, residents of the Cranley Gardens apartment complex in North London began complaining about their drains being clogged up. Initially, their landlord was dismissive and said, "Oh, it's just an old building, it's old plumbing, and that's why it's slow." But eventually, the landlord conceded and asked a plumber to come out and have a look. And so, on the evening of February 8th, an experienced plumber named Mike came out to Cranley Gardens, and after learning what the complaints were, he went around to the side of the building and he opened up a drain cover to have a look inside. As expected, when he shined his light down, he saw wads of hair and napkins and other things kind of mashed together, clogging up the pipes. And so he reached in and he began pulling the stuff out and putting it in a bucket right next to him. And then after he had cleared the majority of the obstruction, he reached his arm all the way into this pipe to feel around to see if there was anything in there that he just couldn't see. And at some point, as he was reaching, when his arm was almost completely into this pipe, his hand hit a major blockage. And so he moved his fingers around to try to feel what it was, but he couldn't tell. It was something that was fairly soft, but there were some hard things inside of it, like sticks or rods. So he grabbed a handful of this blockage and he pulled his arm back out of the pipe. He opened his hand, and what he was holding looked like ground meat, but it wasn't any meat he had ever seen before. And inside of this fleshy substance looked like little bits of bone. Now, Mike had cleared many pipes before, and he had never seen meat be the reason for a blockage. And so this whole situation just seemed really strange, and he decided, it's late, I'll just come back tomorrow with my supervisor so he can see what this is too. So Mike puts the cap back on the drain pipe, and he walks out from behind the building back out towards his truck parked on the road. And as he's walking, two of the residents of this complex come out and they say, hey, did you fix the blockage? What was it? And Mike would say no, he hadn't. And then he just kind of blurted out that there was meat in the pipes. That was what was causing the blockage. And then one of these two residents says, well, I bet people are just flushing their Kentucky Fried Chicken down the drains. That's what's causing it. And Mike looked at him and he was like, yeah, maybe. And then he just turned around, got in his truck, and he drove away. Early the next morning, Mike and his supervisor came back to Cranley Gardens, and they went around to the side of the building. They undid that cap, and then Mike reached down inside expecting to feel this blockage, but where it should have been, there was nothing. Somebody had cleared the pipes. And so Mike and his supervisor are looking at each other, and Mike is like, there's no way that cleared on its own. Someone had to have come out here and cleared it, but I don't know why they would have done that and still had us come out. But the men decide, you know what, maybe by chance it did just kind of slip through and clear itself, so let's just continue the process and make sure each of the apartment buildings, their individual pipe is unobstructed. And when they checked these pipes, they found all of them were clear except for one, apartment number 23, whose pipe was blocked up with more of this meaty substance. Mike and his partner were already very suspicious of the fact that someone had snuck out here in the middle of the night and cleared the pipe. Probably. They didn't know if that happened, but it seemed likely. And now they're finding more of this weird meat substance coming from a particular apartment. And so the whole situation just seemed off. And so they told the landlord that they were not going to touch this. Somebody else had to come out and deal with this. And the landlord, after finding out there was meat jammed in the pipes, got really freaked out and called the police. The police showed up, they pulled this meat substance out of the pipes, and they sent it to a mortuary where a pathologist looked at it and said, this is meat. It's human meat. And in particular, the stuff that was pulled out of apartment number 23's pipes is that of a human neck. So the police go back to Cranley Gardens, they go up to apartment number 23, they knock on the door, and when the door opens, they're hit with this overwhelming stench of just rotting flesh. And standing in the doorway of this apartment, the owner of the apartment, is this guy who's in his late 30s, early 40s, who introduces himself as Dennis Nielsen. And they say, hey, Dennis, can we have a look around your apartment? And he says, why? And they say, well, we found human remains in your pipes. And Dennis immediately says, oh my goodness, I can't believe that. That's horrible. But the police are not buying it. And they say, you know what, Dennis, tell us where the rest of the body is. And at this, Dennis suddenly went expressionless, emotionless, and he just turns around and he points into his bedroom and he says, it's in 2 plastic bags in my closet. And so before the police go into his apartment to go inspect these bags, they say, Dennis, are there any other bodies in your apartment that we should know about? And Dennis sighs and he looks up to the ceiling and says, yeah, there's about 15 or 16 here. It's a long story. It goes way back. I'd love to tell it to you, get this off my chest, and I'll do it at the police station. So after Dennis was arrested and brought to the station, he told them his horrible story. It had all started 5 years earlier in 1978 when Dennis was 33. He was at a pub having some drinks by himself when a teenager came into the bar and attempted to buy an alcoholic drink. And he was denied service. And so Dennis pulled him aside and said, hey, I'd be happy to give you a drink at my apartment. It's right down the road. And the young man, whose name was Steven, was very excited about this and said, great, let's go. Once they arrived back and they were up in Dennis's apartment, the pair had lots of drinks and they were having fun and laughing. And then at some point, the pair climbed into bed together. The next morning, when Dennis got up, his new friend, Steven, was still sleeping right next to him. And he had this sudden, overwhelming sense of dread because he knew as soon as Steven woke up, he would see this as a one-night stand and he would just leave. He would not stick around and remain friends with Dennis. And Dennis just did not like that idea. He wanted Steven to stay. And so he looked on the ground next to the bed and he saw the necktie that Steven had been wearing was on the ground. And so he got on the ground, he grabbed the necktie, he fashioned it into a noose, and then he climbed back on the bed, got on top of Steven's chest, and he looped the tie around his neck, and then he pulled it as tight as he could. And as soon as it was tight, Dennis would tell police that Steven came alive. And he began reaching for his neck and kicking Dennis as hard as he could, but he just can't get it off. And at some point, Dennis said Steven just seemed to give up. He looked up at Dennis and knew he wasn't going to get this off and that Dennis was determined to kill him. And so Steven just allowed himself to go limp and then he slouched over. And as soon as that happened, Dennis said he relaxed. But as he's looking at Steven, he realized he wasn't dead. He was just unconscious. And so Dennis goes into the kitchen and he gets this huge plastic bucket and he fills it up with water and he sets it in the middle of his kitchen floor. And then he gets a bunch of kitchen chairs and he lines them up like a table right in front of this bucket of water. And then he drags Steven's body into the kitchen and he lays him on his back on these chairs, but make sure his head is not resting on the chair. His head is kind of dangling off the back of these chairs. And then he grabbed that bucket of water and he slid it right underneath Steven's head. And then Dennis got on top of the chairs, on top of Steven, and then he pressed the young man's face straight down so his head went backwards until his mouth and his nose were under the water. And Dennis held him like that until Steven regained consciousness, but again, he didn't fight it. He knew he was doomed. And after several minutes, the bubbles stopped coming to the surface and Steven was dead. Dennis pulled his victim off of the chairs. He brought him into the living room and he sat him on a chair. And then Dennis went into the kitchen and he made himself a cup of coffee and he smoked some cigarettes. And then he just stood in the doorway and looked at Steven's body. And he would tell police it was a very bizarre experience because Steven still looked like he was alive. In fact, Dennis would try talking to him as if he was going to talk back, but obviously he didn't. And at some point, Dennis realized, the life he had before he killed Steven was now over. He had a new life and he didn't really know how to handle it. And so the first thing he thought to do was to clean Steven. So he took Steven's body and he brought him into the bathroom and he gave him a very long bath, cleaned his body, cleaned his hair, and then afterwards he got him out, he dressed him and put him into his bed, and then Dennis climbed into bed with him and laid with him. And he would tell police as he laid there, he suddenly felt overjoyed. Steven was not going to leave him. He was going to stay here as long as Dennis wanted him to. After laying with him for some time, Dennis realized he had to find a way to hide Steven's body in his apartment so no one could find him. And so he left his apartment and he went to a hardware store where he got an electric knife and a big storage bin. He brought them back to his apartment, and as he was about to cut Steven up, he just couldn't go through with it. So instead, he just climbed into bed and took a nap next to Steven's body. When he got up again, he moved Steven's body onto the ground in his living room and covered him with a blanket. And then he went and made dinner and then sat in his chair in the living room right next to this body on the ground and watched TV for a while. When he was done watching TV and eating, he looked at the body on the floor and realized, he really hadn't made any progress in terms of hiding him somewhere in his apartment. And that's when he remembered he had a loose floorboard in his apartment. And so he went over to the loose floorboard, he pulled it up, and he saw there was a space under the floors. And so he pulled a couple more boards up, and then he grabbed Steven's body and he attempted to force him down into this space. But by now, Steven's body had begun to stiffen up from rigor mortis. Specifically, his arms were outstretched like a Y over his head. And so as Dennis is trying to force him down in there, his arms were not allowing him to go down into that small space. So Dennis took Steven's body and he propped him up against the wall in his bedroom. So the body is against the wall, rigid, standing up with its arms up over its head, and Steven's eyes were still open. And then after that, Dennis just got in bed and fell asleep. So all night, this corpse is staring at Dennis in his bed. And then the next morning when Dennis got up, there was Steven still up against the wall with his hands in the air looking down at him. Dennis grabbed Steven's body and put it on the ground, and he began yanking and jerking and pulling on each of Steven's arms until they were pinned down by his side. And then after that, Dennis started working on his legs and his hips, and he began contorting him until he was small enough that he could pack him down under his floor. And then once he was under there, he just put the boards on top and went about his daily life. And for the next couple of days, he totally forgot about Steven. But a week after putting him under the floor, Dennis decided he missed Steven and he wanted to see him again. And so one night he opened up the floorboards, he looked down, and there was Steven, and Dennis would say it looked like he was dirty. So he pulled him out of the floor and he gave him another bath. And then after he had cleaned Steven, he pulled him out of the water, he dried him off, and he put him in the chair. And then Dennis took a bath himself in the same water he had just used to clean Steven. After a long soak in this tub, Dennis finally got out, he toweled himself off, he redressed Steven, and then he forced him back onto the floorboards and covered him up again. And he would remain there for the next 7 months until Dennis finally decided to dispose of him by burning him in a bonfire outside of their apartment building. And then after the body was completely incinerated and gone, Dennis remembered thinking, I can't believe I just got away with murder. And so he would do it again and again and again, killing at least 15 young men from North London, all by strangulation or by drowning or a combination of the two. And after he killed them, he would keep them stashed in his apartment for months at a time, in his closet, in his cabinets, in his bed, under the floors, all over his apartment. He had these bodies. And while these bodies were in his apartment, he liked to periodically take them out to spend time with them. He would tell police he found corpses to be beautiful. He was fascinated by them. But eventually, in 1983, he had so many bodies stashed all over his apartment that he knew he really needed to expedite getting rid of them. And so he began cutting them up and trying to force them down his drain, which eventually clogged the pipes. And so when Mike the plumber showed up and discovered this meaty substance in the pipes, and Dennis overheard him talking about it, that night after Mike was gone, Dennis had gone outside and attempted to clear the rest of the remains from the pipes. But he wasn't aware there were still remains stuck in the pipe that led to his specific apartment. Dennis Nielsen confessed to killing 15 young men and attempting to kill at least 7 others, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Dennis never showed any remorse, nor did he show any desire to want to be free again. He actually said he deserved to be in jail for what he did. In 2018, Dennis Nielsen would die in prison at the age of 72. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's video, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, the next time you're in a very crowded parking lot and you see the like button driving around looking for a spot, flag them down and point to your parked car as if you're going to leave, and then go over to your car and spend a few minutes fumbling for your keys before just walking away. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. I also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballin Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please give the like button a metal tin of delicious Danish butter cookies and tell them it's your way of apologizing for the mistreatment over the past year. But be sure to replace the cookies with anthrax before you hand it over. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In May of 2011, 27-year-old Michalina Lewandowska was surprised when she got a text message from her on-again, off-again boyfriend, 27-year-old Marcin Kazperzak. The pair had actually previously been engaged and had a 3-year-old son together, but they just could never seem to make it work for longer than a couple of months at a time. In the text message, Marcin was asking Michalina if he could take her shopping, something he knew she liked to do. As for Michalina, lately she had been turning down requests like this one from Marcin, and she was inclined to at first, but their son was already being looked after by her mother, and Michalina didn't have plans that day, and so she thought, you know what the heck? And so she said yes. So Michalina took a shower and got ready, and even put on her engagement ring that Marcin had given her, and then she waited by the door. A little while later, Marcin, who was an aspiring bodybuilder who had become addicted to taking steroids, showed up at her Huddersfield, England home. Michalina opened the door, Marcin came inside, and then as soon as the door shut behind him, he tased Michalina, he jumped on top of her, and then he bound and gagged her. And then once she was restrained on the ground with no idea what was going on, Marcin opened the front door and waved down to his car that was parked on the curb, and one of his friends, this 18-year-old named Patrick, came out and walked up to the house and came inside. And then Patrick and Marcin worked together to cram Michalina into this small, rugged cardboard box. And then once she was forced inside of there, they closed it up, taped it shut, and then brought the box down to the front of the house and put it into Marcin's trunk. And then Marcin and Patrick hopped in the front 2 seats of the car and drove off. Once they reached the outskirts of town, they parked in a parking lot right next to this huge forest. And from there, they took the box with Michalina inside of it and 2 shovels and walked into the woods. And at some point, they left the path and walked way away from where anybody would normally be until they felt like they were far enough away that no one would see them. And at that point, they put Michalina down, and then using their shovels, they dug a grave. Once it was deep enough, they put Michelina in her box inside of the grave, and then they covered her back up with dirt and then put a 90-pound log on top of her, and then the two of them just walked away, leaving Michelina to die. In the box, Michelina was not dead yet, but she knew if she attempted to escape with Marcin and Patrick right above her, they would just kill her on the spot, or they would dig an even deeper hole, and then it would be impossible to get out again. And so after waiting an agonizingly long amount of time to ensure Marcin and Patrick had gone, Michelina jumped into action. She immediately tried to wriggle her way out of her restraints, but the position they had forced her into, which was basically the fetal position with her hands tied behind her back, it didn't allow her to move very much in any one direction, and so without any movement, she could not get herself to come free of these restraints. And so as she's struggling, trying to figure out what she's going to do, she realizes she had chosen to wear her engagement ring that Marcin had given her, something she never wore anymore, and she could potentially use the diamonds in the ring to cut through the tape that was keeping her wrists tied together. And so she began working that ring until finally she did cut through her restraints and her hands were free. And so she managed to force both of her arms right in front of her body, and then once they were in front of her, she immediately began scratching and clawing at the cardboard right above her. And eventually she scratched a hole in the box itself, and dirt began pouring in on her, and she was already very low on oxygen. She was fighting off unconsciousness by remembering that her 3-year-old son needed her, and she had no idea what Marcin was going to do to him. And so she just kept on digging and fighting as the dirt's coming in on her and she's struggling to breathe. And then finally she pokes all the way through and she can see sunlight and fresh air comes into the hole. She can breathe again. And then with this huge surge of adrenaline, she forces herself and manages to push all the way up through this hole until she's standing in her grave. And from there, she pulls herself up and out of the dirt, and she runs towards the road where she flags down a motorist, and the motorist would call police and then wait with her until they arrived. After Marcin was arrested, the story came out that he had heard a rumor that Michelina was going to be leaving him and going back to Poland with their son, and he didn't want that, so he had decided he was going to kill her. Marcin was found guilty of attempted murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison, and Patrick was found guilty of kidnapping and sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. In 1932, Charlie Pollard was a 26-year-old farmer living in Macon County, Alabama, where 82% of the population at the time was African American, and they were all forced to live under the rules of a strictly segregated society. At the time, the United States was just beginning to crawl out of the Great Depression that had started 3 years earlier, but you wouldn't know it riding through Charlie's town. Like Charlie, many of the other residents in Macon County were completely dirt poor, and they lived in these wooden shacks with no screens on the windows, there was no furniture inside, and they would just throw some dirty rags on the ground to sleep on. On average, the men in the town that were lucky enough to have a job made less than $1 per day. So when Charlie heard a rumor that the government was going to be coming to town and giving free medical exams to all the African American men, Charlie was thrilled. He had never been to a doctor before, and he certainly wasn't going to turn down a free visit to one. And so a couple of days later, the rumor turned out to be true when a government health service worker showed up in their town and set up shop in their one-room schoolhouse. Charlie got in line with the hundreds of other men from Macon County, and then by mid-morning, it was his turn, and the health service worker told him that today they were just going to be doing a blood test. And so Charlie eagerly rolled up his sleeve and stuck his arm out. A couple of days later, the results from the blood test had come in, and Charlie was informed that he had bad blood. Bad blood was a commonly used term in that area at the time to describe a wide array of ailments. The worker didn't get into specifics about what Charlie's diagnosis meant. They just told him that in virtue of his diagnosis of bad blood, he was now eligible to join a government-sponsored medical treatment program. If he agreed to be a part of it, he would not only receive medical care for his bad blood, he would also receive free rides to and from the health clinic, he would get a free hot meal on examination days, and in the event he died during the program, his family would be given $50 if they allowed the doctors to perform a thorough autopsy on his body before they buried him. Despite not really understanding what it meant to have bad blood, Charlie decided to join the program, mostly because of those free meals and because he had a deep trust and respect of the government. And Charlie wasn't alone. About 400 other African American men from Macon County agreed to be a part of the program as well. At first, the program was everything they promised it would be. It was just a couple of low-key medical examinations with a nice hot meal, and then occasionally they would take some pills and have another blood draw. But eventually they started being given regular, excruciatingly painful spinal taps that would leave them bedridden for weeks afterwards. But despite this painful and surprising turn of events that none of the men saw coming, they were not aware they would be getting spinal taps as part of this program. Charlie and the other men were convinced this program was still in their best interest and that they could trust the government to eventually cure them of their bad blood. And so Charlie and the other men didn't resist the spinal taps or other follow-on painful and bizarre medical procedures that they were being told was good for them and would help them get rid of this bad blood. Less than a year later, men in this program began getting sick. They started developing rashes and sores all over their body. Their bones and joints would ache. They began losing hair. They had indigestion. They had headaches. They had constant fevers. And for some of the men, these symptoms would eventually subside. But for others, they got dramatically worse. For those men, they would develop tumors and their bones would start to disintegrate. They would go blind or deaf or become paralyzed, or they would simply die. But despite the obvious ineffectiveness of this treatment program, it persisted. When America entered World War II in 1941, Charlie and many of the other men in this program wanted to enlist in the military and go join the fight. But when they went to enlist, they were told that as members of this special medical program, they could only receive treatment from the doctors in that program. And so they could not receive treatment from military doctors and therefore were disqualified from military service. While frustrated by this rule, Charlie and many of the other men still considered themselves to be very fortunate to be allowed to be a part of this program that was curing them of their bad blood. And Charlie specifically felt like he was one of the luckiest men inside of this program because his bad blood had not led to these terrible symptoms that his friends were experiencing. And so over the years, in between his medical appointments, Charlie got married, he had a child, he even managed to buy a little plot of land that he farmed on nearly year-round. Then, in 1973, so over 40 years after they began this medical program, Charlie and the other survivors of this program had their lives completely turned upside down. That year, a very junior assistant within the Public Health Service secretly mailed off all of the records of this Macon County medical program to the Associated Press. And then a couple of days later, the Washington Star newspaper ran this huge story on their front page that said syphilis victims in United States study went untreated for 40 years. It would turn out Charlie and the other 400 men in this medical program, they didn't have bad blood. That was just kind of a made-up term to get them not to ask any questions. What they had was syphilis, a deadly disease that ravages the human body in 3 stages that can unfold over a lifetime. And so these doctors that treated Charlie were not actually treating him. They knew he had syphilis. That was why he was even part of the program to begin with. When they tested his blood, they were trying to see who had syphilis in Macon County, and then they took those people and they entered them into this phony program, not to make them better, because this was not a treatment program. It was a U.S. government-backed medical study of what happens to African-American men with syphilis if their condition goes completely untreated for their entire lives. The leaders of the study did not care what happened to these men. And that point was made crystal clear when in the 1940s, a cure for syphilis was discovered, penicillin. But instead of giving it to these men and saving their lives, they intentionally hid the cure from them and prevented them from getting it. This is why these men were not allowed to enlist in the military or seek outside medical care, because those doctors would discover these men had syphilis and they would just give them penicillin, curing them, but that screwed up the study, and so they couldn't have that. The Public Health Service chose Macon County, Alabama, because at the time, 35% of the population was already infected with syphilis, and because they knew the men in this town would be largely uneducated and poor and desperate, and therefore easy to trick into joining this highly unethical study. At least 28 men in the study died as a result of their syphilis infections, and countless others suffered from long-term side effects. Charlie was 66 years old when he heard the news. Finally, he had an answer. Bad blood meant he had syphilis, but fortunately, his syphilis had either burned out or gone dormant. But he thought about all the other men in the study that had not been as lucky, and Charlie felt so betrayed by the government. He and the rest of the men had no idea they were getting taken advantage of. Charlie got in touch with a lawyer who eventually sued the federal government, and in an out-of-court settlement, Charlie and the other 73 survivors of the so-called Tuskegee experiment were given $38,000 each as compensation. After the settlement, Charlie just went back to his simple life in Macon County. And then 27 years later, on April 29th, 2000, Charlie passed away at the age of 94. In the early morning hours of March 11th, 1989, four young men who were all in their 20s and all very close friends left their homes in East Texas and headed south. 9 hours later, they arrived in the beautiful resort town of South Padre Island, which is just off the coast of southern Texas. They were there to enjoy their spring break by sunning on the beach, drinking in bars, and meeting girls. When they finally arrived that night, they were so exhausted from the trip that they went right to bed. The next morning, when they got up, they went straight down to the beach and they had some drinks. And then by the afternoon, they were talking amongst themselves and they decided that for their first full night of being on vacation, they would kick things off with a bang and they would go into Mexico and party there. And so they piled into their car and they drove an hour southwest to Brownsville, Texas, which is a town that sits right on the border of Mexico. And when they got there, they parked their car and then walked right over the footbridge that crossed the Rio Grande River into Mexico. On the other side, in Mexico, they found themselves in the town of Matamoros, which is very popular amongst spring break goers for their bars and their clubs. And so the four friends got a quick bite to eat at a hamburger joint, and then they made their way into the bars and the clubs, and they danced and they drank for hours. And then at some point, they got tired and left the bar scene. They crossed over the footbridge back into the U.S. and made their way back to their hotel in South Padre Island. The next morning, when they got up and they recovered from their hangover, they decided they had so much fun in Matamoros the night before that they had to go back. And so that night, they piled back into their car, they drove back down to Brownsville, Texas, they crossed over that footbridge into Mexico, and then all night they partied and danced and had a great time. And then at some point, the four decided it was time to leave, and so they left their bar and began walking towards the footbridge. But that night, it was so crowded in Matamoros that you could barely move a foot without bumping into someone. And so the foursome split into two separate pairs. And the lead pair, they made their way ahead, and they stopped at the gift shop right at the foot of that bridge going back to the U.S. side, and there they waited for the trail pair. The trail pair, which consisted of Mark Kilroy and Bill Huddleston, they weren't far behind, but they got sidetracked when Mark saw a girl standing next to a house that he had seen earlier in the night, and he just wanted to go up and talk to her and say bye to her. And so they go over to this girl, and while Mark is talking to her, Bill moves on ahead and goes down an alleyway to urinate. And then when he comes back out, Mark and this girl are not there. Bill assumed Mark must have just moved on the little ways up to the bridge where the other two friends were at the gift shop. And so after looking around for just a couple of seconds, Bill makes his way up to the bridge and he meets up with the other two friends. And when he gets there, he asks the other two friends, where's Mark? Did he come up here already? And they say, no, we haven't seen him. And so now the trio's a little bit concerned, but they're thinking, okay, he must be with this girl he had seen. And so they backtracked a little ways and they looked for Mark. They went back to where he had been talking to that girl, and again, he wasn't there. And so they decided, okay, he must have already crossed the bridge and made it to our car, and he's probably just waiting for us over there. And so the trio crosses over the bridge into the U.S. side. They get to their car, and Mark's not there. And so at this point, they are pretty concerned about Mark, but they eventually convince themselves that he must have just left with this girl, and they probably are back at the hotel together. And so after a little while, the trio decides, let's just go back to the hotel. We're bound to find Mark. And so they drive all the way back to South Padre Island. They get to their hotel room, and Mark's not there. But again, they tell themselves he's not here because he's probably with this girl in another room. And so they don't worry about him. They go to bed. But the next morning, when Mark still had not come back to the hotel room, they decide, you know what, something's wrong here. We have to tell police. And so they file a missing person report, but the police get so many of these about spring breakers who go missing in Matamoros that they don't really take them seriously at first, because typically the missing person will just show up 24 hours later with a horrible hangover and no memory of how they got back from Matamoros. And so the police were expecting this to happen with Mark, but after 24 hours, when Mark didn't show up with a bad hangover, they were convinced that something had happened to him. And American and Mexican police suspected foul play because Matamoros and the surrounding areas are not exactly safe for tourists, but they didn't have any leads, and so Mark's case languished. 3 weeks later, a drug smuggler drove through a police checkpoint without stopping just outside of Matamoros. And so the police pursued him, and this guy ultimately stopped at this secluded ranch up in the mountains. After the police arrested the smuggler, they noticed a ranch worker was standing nearby, and on a whim, they showed him a picture of Mark and said, hey, have you seen this guy? And the worker, despite being scared and not really sure what to do, he said to police, yeah, I have seen him here. The smuggler and his friends, they brought him here in handcuffs. And then the worker turned around and pointed up the mountain towards the shack that was about 400 yards up the mountain, and he said that's where they took him. And so authorities began walking up the hillside towards the shack, and when they got about 100 yards away, they saw this big metal cauldron sitting on the front stoop of the shack. And then when they got about 50 yards away, they were hit with this horrible smell of death and decay. And then when they got right up in front of the shack and could see inside of this cauldron and inside of the shack itself, what they saw was so gruesome and horrible that even the most senior and grizzled responding officers were totally shaken up by it. Under intense questioning, the drug smuggler that had originally led police up to the secluded ranch and the shack admitted that he was a part of a gang and that his gang had taken Mark. 3 weeks earlier, while Bill was urinating in that alleyway, Mark spoke to that girl he wanted to see, and then she went off, and then Mark was left standing alone waiting for Bill to come back. And while he was waiting, a man on the street parked in a red truck yelled out to him to come over. He needed help or something. He lured him to the truck. And so Mark went over to the truck, and then right when he asked the man, what do you need? 2 men, one of which included this drug smuggler, jumped out from behind a building and tried to grab Mark and put him inside of this red truck. Mark was a very fit, big, athletic guy, and so he was able to fight the 2 men off and then took off running down the road. But he only made it about 2 blocks when another car full of gangsters showed up, cut him off, and then at gunpoint got him to come into the second vehicle. And so once he was restrained inside of this vehicle, they drove him out of the town of Matamoros onto some backcountry roads up into the mountains to this secluded ranch where they left him overnight in the car. The next morning, the gang members came back out and they wrapped duct tape around Mark's mouth and his whole face and his eyes. They just left a little slit around his nostrils so he could breathe. And then they pulled him out of the vehicle with his hands tied behind his back, and they walked him up the hill to that shack. This gang that had abducted Mark, that this drug smuggler was a part of, was more like a cult. And this cult was led by a man named Constanzo, who practiced a form of black magic called Palo. Constanzo would perform Palo rituals, which he claimed to his followers would make he and all of them invincible. These rituals, which took place in the shack up in the mountains, involved human sacrifice. Constanzo would tell his followers that these people who were going to be sacrificed, they didn't just need to die, they needed to die screaming. Because Constanzo believed the more agony he inflicted on his victims before they ultimately died and were sacrificed to the gods, the more power the gods would grant to he and his followers. And so the people who got kidnapped and marched up to that shack to be sacrificed were subjected to unspeakable atrocities, and Mark had been selected to be the next ritual sacrifice. After Mark was led out of the vehicle with his face all taped up, he was walked up to that shack where he spent several horrifying hours with Constanzo and his cronies, and then at some point Mark was killed when a machete was brought down on the back of his neck. Afterwards, Mark's brain was removed and placed into their sacred cauldron and boiled, and then Mark's legs were removed, and then a long wire was inserted into Mark's torso and fished around inside of him until they hooked it onto his spinal column, and then they buried his torso and his legs, and they left that wire protruding from his body up out of the dirt. There was basically a lead poking out of the ground. And the reason they did that was because later on, they could just pull on that wire and pull up Mark's bones and use his bones to make jewelry. Mark's body was one of 15 discovered in and around this shack. The total number of people that Constanzo and his cult ritualistically murdered is at least 16, but believed to be closer to 26. However, the police were not able to get the official number from Constanzo because Constanzo had his followers shoot and kill him before the police could get to him. 5 other cult members were ultimately convicted for their roles in the cult's murders, and they were each given a sentence of over 60 years in prison. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please give the like button a metal tin of delicious Danish butter cookies and tell them it's your way of apologizing for all the mistreatment over the past year. But be sure to replace the cookies with anthrax before you hand it over. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. I also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballin Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
Scheduled doctor's appointment, turned in expenses, hit the gym, Got to your to-do list, eat healthy today, take your vitamins? Yeah, life gets busy, but adding nutritional support, not complicated. One-a-day vitamins are formulated to support healthy energy metabolism with B vitamins to help convert food to fuel, healthy muscle function, and immune skin and bone health. It's kind of a multitasking vitamin. Grab your one-a-day vitamins at your favorite retailer today.
Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to teach the like button how to drive in your car, and then on the day of their first lesson, show up in your 18-speed transmission semi-tractor trailer truck. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. Just after midnight on June 22nd, 1991, Charles Holden was on his way home from work when he decided to stop at a fast food restaurant near his house in Harrington, Delaware. After grabbing a quick bite to eat, Charles left the store and got back in his truck. He turned it on and he was about to drive out of the lot when he stopped because there was this man running towards him, waving, trying to flag him down. So Charles put his truck back in park and he rolled his window down to see what this guy wanted. And when this stranger got close enough, he told Charles that his sister was having a baby and he needed a ride to the hospital, which was about 20 minutes away. Charles couldn't tell if this guy was lying. It was super late. He didn't know this guy, and he just had a bad feeling about him. And so he told him, "No, I'm sorry. It's too late. I gotta get home. It's too far out of the way." The stranger immediately looked dejected and turned around and started walking away. And as Charles was watching him go, he felt bad and said, "You know what? Hey, come back here. I'll give you a ride part of the way there." And so the stranger smiled, hopped in his passenger seat, and they took off. Charles drove him approximately 3 miles in the direction he had asked to go before pulling over on the side of the road and telling him, "This is as far as I'm going to take you." Charles lived only about a block away, and he didn't want to drive too far away from home so late at night. But the stranger, upon hearing he was being let out so soon, suddenly became angry and began fumbling in his pocket like he was going to get a knife or some sort of weapon, and he starts screaming at Charles, "Hand over your keys, hand over your wallet, or I'm going to kill you." Charles, meanwhile, was on edge just being in the car with this guy because he had a bad feeling about him, and so he immediately jumped into action. He turned off his truck, he ripped the keys out of the ignition, and he leapt out of his truck and started running. Charles saw way off in the distance was a convenience store, and he figured he could run to there and get some help. But as he's running, he turns around and sees the stranger has also leapt out of the car and was now sprinting up to him with a screwdriver in his hand. And this stranger was running really fast. He was gaining on Charles, and soon Charles realized he wasn't going to make it to the convenience store before this guy caught up to him. And so at some point, Charles just stops, he turns around, and he puts his hands up, and he says, okay, I'll give you a ride wherever you want to go, and then you can have my keys, my wallet, you can have anything you want. And so the stranger runs right up to Charles, and he stops, and he smiles, because he's very pleased with this result. And he pokes him with the screwdriver and kind of gestures for him to go back to the truck. So Charles walks back to the truck with the stranger right behind him with the screwdriver periodically poking him in the back. They finally get to the vehicle, and the stranger tells Charles to get in the car and then wait. But as soon as Charles sat down, he fired up his truck and sped off before the stranger could hop in the passenger side door. And so Charles is flying away from this guy. He looks in his rearview mirror, and he can see the guy is chasing after him with a screwdriver held over his head, but he sees the stranger at some point just stops, turns around, and walks away. Charles was totally relieved that he had escaped this horrible encounter, and he was thinking about calling the police, but ultimately decided he wouldn't because it was his decision to allow some stranger to get in his car in the middle of the night. And so Charles kind of blamed himself for the whole ordeal. What Charles was concerned about, though, was where he had ditched the stranger was not far from his house, and he was worried if he just turned around and drove right back to his house, that this guy could recognize the truck and then follow him to his house, and then who knows what could happen. And so Charles decides he's just going to stay outside of town and drive around for a while to make sure this stranger is long gone by the time he comes back. So after about an hour of doing just that, driving around outside of town, Charles goes back into Harrington, Delaware, and he gets on his street, and he's shocked when he sees the stranger who had just tried to kill him is walking down the road right in front of him. But luckily, the stranger did not hear or see Charles pull onto his street. And so Charles immediately throws it in reverse and he gets out of there and he drives off. At this point, Charles decides he needs to tell police because he doesn't know if this stranger actually knows him and that maybe he's targeting him and he's waiting for him at his property. And so he calls 911 and he tells the dispatcher about what had happened earlier and how this guy is now lurking around his property. And the dispatcher tells him they'll send an officer out to him. And so a few minutes later, an officer showed up at the payphone where Charles was, and they told Charles they would escort him back to his property. And if the stranger was still out in the area, they would arrest him. And so the two of them made their way back to Charles's property. They get there, the stranger's long gone, and then Charles goes into his house. There's no sign of a break-in. There's no sign that anyone was near his property. And so Charles thanks the officer. He feels totally relieved. But before the officer leaves, he asks him if he wouldn't mind doing a quick sweep of his mother's property. She lived right behind Charles on the other side of some bushes. He told the officer her name was Dorothy, she was 70 years old, and she lived alone, and he just wanted to make sure nothing happened to her. So the officer said, no problem, I'll go check in on her. So the officer leaves Charles and goes across his backyard through those bushes into Dorothy's backyard, and right away he can see the back window on the back door has been smashed and the door itself is slightly ajar. And so the officer draws their pistol and they go up and they enter the house and they look inside, they're yelling for Dorothy, but there's no answer. It's totally dark in the house, it's totally silent. And so after searching the first floor and finding nothing, they make their way up the flight of stairs and they find blood at the top of the landing. And they follow this trail of blood and it brings them into one of the bedrooms where a woman is sprawled out on a bed. It was Dorothy. She had been stabbed to death. It would turn out, after Charles had ditched the stranger and sped off without him, the stranger, whose name was Gilbert Cannon, began looking for a place to sleep, and the house he ultimately selected just happened to be Charles's mother's house. After Gilbert broke in through her back door, he saw Dorothy coming down the steps to confront him, and because he was worried she'd be able to identify him, he attacked her with a screwdriver. Gilbert would later tell police that the attack on Charles was completely random. He was just at this fast food restaurant, he saw Charles get into his truck, and he thought to himself, if I can get in that guy's truck, I bet I can rob him. And then after this failed robbery, when Gilbert is out looking for a place to sleep and he breaks into this house, and this woman comes down the stairs that he attacks and kills, he has no idea that this woman, Dorothy, is Charles's mother. The entire night was one big, horrible coincidence. Gilbert would plead guilty to the murder and would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 1949, 15-year-old problem child Ken Rex McElroy dropped out of school and moved to a tiny farming town called Skidmore, Missouri. There, he began his life of crime, which consisted primarily of theft. At night, he would drive his truck onto Skidmore residents' property, and he would steal their livestock, alcohol, grain, food, antiques, anything he could get his hands on and that he could sell, he would take. And if the owners ever caught him in the act, he would just raise his rifle at them and tell them to go back inside and never report it to the police or he would kill them. And because Rex was this big 270-pound monster of a man who was known for having a bad temper and for being really aggressive, people generally just did what he asked and his crimes went totally unreported. In the rare instances that victims would report Rex's crimes to police, Rex would begin intimidating them and their family by staking out their houses at all hours of the night, or he would just walk directly up to these victims and he would say, "I will kill you if you testify against me." And if none of those tactics worked, Rex used some of his illegal money to hire one of the very best defense lawyers in the entire state, a lawyer who had famously represented the mob, and he would step in and get Rex off of virtually any charge, including the time Rex actually did shoot one of the owners who caught him in the act. Over the years, Rex would use these fear and intimidation tactics not just to make money, but also to prey on young women and girls. In the 1970s, when Rex was in his 40s, he began stalking a local Skidmore girl who was 12 years old named Trina. After assaulting her dozens of times, Rex learned her family was going to be pressing charges against him. So Rex burned down Trina's family's house and killed the family dog, and then threatened to kill the entire family unless they signed paperwork that would legally marry their daughter Trina to Rex. This would protect him legally in case they pressed any charges against him. After the family finally relented and signed off on the marriage, Trina was forced to come live with Rex at his house, and within 2 years she became pregnant. After the birth of her child, she took her baby and tried to run away from Rex, and she ran back to her family's new house, and she was hiding there, but Rex tracked her down, he took her and their baby back, and then Rex proceeded to burn her family's house down again and again killed their new family dog. By the end of the 1970s, Rex wasn't only just the most hated person in Skidmore, he was the most destructive person. He had hurt so many people in town, but it seemed like no one could do anything about it. It was like he was untouchable. Then a single piece of candy changed everything. In 1980, one of Rex's children was at a local grocery store in Skidmore when they were caught stealing a piece of candy. When the shopkeeper asked the child to put the candy back, they refused, and it caused this huge fight, and before long, Rex has found out about this huge fight, and Rex, instead of being upset with his child for stealing, he becomes enraged that the shopkeeper had the audacity to accuse his child of a crime. And so Rex began stalking the owner of the store, a 70-year-old man named Bo, along with the rest of Bo's family. At all hours of the night, Rex would just show up in front of their house with a gun slung across his lap, and he would fire shots into the air, and then during the day, he would walk right up to Bo and he would tell him, "I'm going to kill you." And so Bo and his family knew it was only a matter of time before Rex did become violent, and they were right. In July of that year, Rex showed up at Bo's grocery store with a shotgun in hand, and Bo, who was in the back of the shop loading groceries through the back door, he turns around and he sees Rex walking up to him. They have this heated confrontation where at some point Rex just raises a shotgun and he fires a shot into Bo's neck. Bo was gravely wounded, but he would survive, and Rex would actually get arrested and would be charged with attempted murder. And it seemed like, for once, maybe Rex was actually going to get what was coming to him, but he didn't. The attempted murder charge was lowered to just assault, and he was given 2 years in prison, but he would only serve 1 day in jail before being released on bond. And as soon as he was out on bond, he went right to his house and he got his rifle that had a bayonet attached at the end of it, and he went right to the tavern in the middle of Skidmore, and he began telling anybody who would listen that he planned to finish the job, i.e. he was going to kill Bo, and he described in very graphic detail how he planned to do it, which involved this rifle and this bayonet. Patrons that were at the tavern that saw Rex and heard these claims, they were scared for Bo, and so they left the tavern and they told city leaders about these threats. And so city leaders at this point, they've had enough of Rex, and they decide they're going to host this secret meeting that will not include Rex the following morning. So the next morning comes around, and all these angry residents, they come to this meeting, and they begin discussing, how are we going to handle Rex? We can't use police. We can't use politicians. Nothing can be done. So what are we going to do? How are we going to put an end to his reign of terror? And after a while, they came up with a plan. And after the meeting was done, everybody left the town hall, they got their guns, and they made their way over to the tavern where Rex was seen earlier that morning. About 40 of these armed men surrounded the outside of this tavern, and once they were all in place, another smaller group of men that were all armed walked inside the tavern, and they saw Rex sitting at the bar with Trina sitting right next to him. And so these men, they walk up right behind Rex, uncomfortably close, right behind him, and they just stand there with their guns looking at him. And at some point, Rex turns around and sees them, and he's about to lash out and start fighting them, but he realizes he's totally outnumbered, and these men that are standing all around him, they look like they mean business. And so he stands up, he grabs Trina, and he brushes past them, trying to act tough, and he walks out of the tavern. When he gets outside, he's taken aback at this additional group of armed men, which is much larger, who are all standing there just looking in at him. And so Rex, at this point, becomes visibly frightened, but he grabs Trina and he calmly walks out to his truck, which is parked a little ways out in front of the tavern. He gets in the driver's side, she hops in the passenger side, and Rex lights a cigarette up, he turns on his truck, and he's about to try to drive away when a gunshot rings out, and Rex immediately slumps forward onto his wheel. One of the Skidmore residents runs up to the truck, they open up the passenger side, and they grab Trina, who was unhurt, pulled her out, and rushed her to safety. Once she was clear, the other residents with their guns just moved in on the truck, and for 20 seconds they opened fire on Rex. After the shooting was over, nobody called an ambulance. Everyone just stood there and watched as the town bully died. In all, there were 46 witnesses that were there when Rex was murdered, but they all said they had either not seen the shooting or they didn't know who the shooter was. And despite a lengthy federal investigation, none of the witnesses ever changed their stories. And so as a result, no one was ever charged with Rex's murder. Years later, a Skidmore resident, when asked what happened here, they just said that man needed a killing. On the morning of March 18th, 1990, a young woman named Karen parked her car just outside of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. This famous museum is home to over 15,000 pieces of priceless art from ancient Rome, medieval Europe, Renaissance Italy, Asia, the Islamic world, and 19th century France and America. The outside of this 4-story building is strikingly plain, but inside is strikingly gorgeous. There is this lush green open-air courtyard that sits right in the middle of the museum that all of the galleries look down into. Karen was an art enthusiast, and she was a security guard at this museum, and that day she was on duty. After parking her car, she got out and walked her way over to the employee entrance, and there she pressed the buzzer and announced her arrival to the 2 night shift guards that she would be relieving. But after a few seconds, the night shift guards did not respond to her, and they did not unlock the door. And so after a little while, Karen pressed the buzzer again and said, "I'm here, can you please open the door?" But again, the guards that were on duty did not respond back to her, and the door did not open. This was highly unusual, so Karen left the door, found a payphone, and called the chief of security for the museum, who lived out in town, and told him she couldn't get in the building. And so about 10 minutes later, the chief of security shows up, and he takes Karen, and he walks her around to the other side of the building. He leads her up an outdoor flight of stairs to another entrance to the museum. He pulls out a big ring of keys, he finds the right one, and he opens the door. The entrance they were going through placed them in this dark hallway that stretched out straight in front of them, and then at the very end of the hallway on the right was this very brightly lit room that the door was wide open to, and that was the security office where the guards were supposed to be. And so Karen and the chief, they begin walking down this hallway, expecting to get to the end of it and look inside this room and see these guards and get an explanation for why they didn't buzz Karen in the first place. But when they reach the end of the hallway and they look in this office, there's nobody inside of there. And now that they were up close, they could see the door leading into the security office had been smashed open. In fact, the doorknob to this door had been smashed off and was laying on the ground, and then next to it, right in front of them, was this metal crowbar. And then above them, the one camera that would have seen whatever had happened in the hallway, it had been turned around and was facing the wall. So Karen and the chief, they know they've stumbled on something that's probably really bad. They don't know what it is. They don't know if there's still people inside the museum. They don't know where the guards are. So the chief just grabs the crowbar for protection, and he and Karen run into the office and they call police. Although they didn't know it yet, Karen and the chief had just discovered one of the most famous crimes in history. The night before, 23-year-old security guard Rick Abath trudged his way down the walkway towards the employee entrance of the museum. He and another young man named Randy were scheduled to work the overnight shift that night. Rick hated his job at the museum because it was incredibly boring, but Rick didn't really have many other employment opportunities to choose from. He was a guy that had dropped out of music school and spent most of his time smoking marijuana, drinking beer, and playing in his friend's rock band. And so he just kept this job that he hated. Once Rick got inside the museum, he walked over to the office where he found his partner that night, Randy, was already sitting behind the desk. After chatting with him for a few minutes, Rick said he would do the first set of security rounds, and so he grabbed a walkie-talkie and a flashlight, and he headed out to the exhibit halls. Almost immediately, a fire alarm went off. Rick went to the area where it was going off, and he investigated and did not see a fire, and so he just turned the alarm off. The building was very old, and it wasn't uncommon for their electronics to fail or glitch. And so after this, Rick didn't think much of it. He continued doing his security rounds, and after about 30 more minutes of that, he made his way back down to the security office, where he traded places with Randy. Rick took the seat behind the desk, and Randy took the walkie-talkie and flashlight and headed out into the exhibits. About 30 minutes later, while Randy was still doing his security rounds, Rick had his head down on the desk when he heard the sound of the buzzer coming from one of the outside doors. He lifted his head up and he looked at the screen that was connected to the camera, looking down at whoever was outside at this door, and he saw there were 2 police officers standing right outside the door. And so he reached over and he pressed the intercom button and he said, "Hey, can I help you?" And the officers said they were there responding to a disturbance call. Can they come inside? Now, Rick didn't know what this was about. He assumed it must have to do with maybe the fire alarm that had gone off earlier, or maybe somebody outside had seen someone trying to break in and they had called it in. But either way, he felt like it was important enough that he should let them in, even though it was against protocol to allow anyone into the museum after hours, including police. And so the 2 officers, they come through the doors and they wind up in the hallway right outside of the security office, and there's a window into the security office, so both the officers and Rick can see each other. And the officers immediately say to Rick, "Hey, are you working alone tonight?" And Rick says, "No, my partner is out doing security rounds. He'll be back soon." And so the officers just kind of nod their heads and they're looking around the room for a second. And one of them, as he glances at Rick again, he does kind of a double take. He goes, "Wait a minute, I think I know you. There's a warrant out for your arrest. You need to come out here and show me your ID." And so Rick is caught completely off guard, but he just kind of instinctively does what he's told because it's a police officer. And so Rick stands up, he walks out of the office, he goes out into the hallway, and as he's about to present his ID to the inquiring officer, the officer just grabs him, pushes him up against the wall, and handcuffs him. And so before Rick can say anything, Randy, his partner, comes back from doing his security rounds. He walks into the hall and has no idea what's going on. The other officer, the one that had not handcuffed Rick, grabs Randy and does the same thing, presses him up against the wall and handcuffs him. And so as Randy and Rick are standing there up against the wall with their hands behind their back, they're looking at each other, they're looking around thinking, what's going on here? And at some point, Randy just blurts out, why are we being arrested? And that's when one of the officers just says, oh, you're not being arrested, you're being robbed. Rick and Randy were led by the imposter cops down into the basement of this building where they were bound and gagged with duct tape. And then these two thieves proceeded to spend the next 81 minutes walking all around the museum, ultimately stealing 13 pieces of art before destroying the security footage and then fleeing the building. Rick and Randy were discovered unhurt later that morning by police, still tied up in the basement. Despite dozens of suspects, numerous viable theories, and a massive monetary reward, these two art thieves were never caught and remain at large today. As for the 13 pieces of stolen art, one of which includes the extremely rare Rembrandt painting called The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, which is his only seascape in existence, they are still unaccounted for. And combined, they are worth a staggering $500 million. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to teach the like button how to drive in your car. And then on the day of their first lesson, show up in an 18-speed transmission semi-tractor trailer truck. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. I also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballin Shorts, where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See you.
Whether you're tinkering in your garage or tackling big projects, if you know the value of working with your hands, you know Harbor Freight. And you can be confident knowing that at Harbor Freight, you can get quality tools at prices that work just as hard as you do. Because the only thing more satisfying than a job well done is a job well done, well under budget. Whatever you do it for less at Harbor Freight.
Apologies in advance for my nasally voice. I've had some pretty bad allergies over the last couple of days, and it just hasn't cleared up yet. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please ask the like button for a bite of their sandwich, and when they say yes, proceed to pack the biggest bite possible into your mouth. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. People who live on Andover Street on Detroit, Michigan's east side will be the first to tell you that the area is known for constant drug activity. On Thursday, November 9th, 2017, 2 Detroit Special Operations police officers began an operation known as a push-off on Andover Street. A push-off is when undercover cops pretend to be drug dealers, and then when customers come up to them and try to buy drugs, they arrest them and seize their vehicles. These particular officers that would be doing this push-off had been undercover for some time in the area, and so they had a local drug house they used for these types of operations. At some point that day, 2 potential customers came up to the fake drug house. They knocked on the door, and the undercover police officers opened up. They invited them inside, and then once these customers were inside sitting down, they asked the undercover cops if they could buy some drugs. And as soon as the cops heard this, they whipped out their badges, they drew their guns, and they ordered them on the ground. But these potential customers, they didn't get on the ground. Instead, they whipped out their badges and drew their guns, and they said, no, you get on the ground. Because it would turn out these customers were actually undercover police officers too, but they were from a different precinct, and so neither groups had any idea about the other. They had no clue that they were both undercover at the same time. Both sets of undercover cops were so surprised by what was happening that instead of firing shots at each other, they just stayed in this really tense standoff, like that famous scene from The Office where they're all pointing guns at each other and they're trying to figure out who the double agent is. And so the police are doing that, periodically hurling insults and threats at the other side in an attempt to get them to stand down. But when neither side stood down, they all just eventually lowered their guns and then proceeded to beat the living crap out of each other. After the dust finally settled and all the haymakers had stopped, the two groups of police realized their mistake and apologized to each other. Luckily, none of the officers were badly hurt from this mix-up. However, two officers did have to go to the hospital, but for very minor injuries. One had a black eye and the other had a split lip. While Detroit's own chief of police and the media and the public at large have all come out and said this snafu was a total embarrassment, others have said the officers involved might deserve a little bit of credit, because after all, their job was to be undercover, and apparently they were so good at being undercover that they didn't even know the other group was undercover too, and vice versa. So perhaps they were just too good at their jobs. You be the judge. The following story was pulled from a 1997 article in the British Medical Journal. The article was written by the psychiatrist who treated the patient, who will be the focal point of this story. The only reason I bring this up is because this story truly sounds made up, and it's not. One night in the winter of 1984, a healthy middle-aged woman, who we'll call Brenda for this story, was at her home in London reading a book when she suddenly heard a voice in her head. It said,
"Please don't be afraid. I know this must be shocking for you to hear me speaking to you like this, but this was the easiest way I could think of. My friend and I, we used to work at the Children's Hospital, and we would like to help you."
Brenda couldn't believe what was happening. She had never heard voices in her head before, and this voice that was speaking to her, it was so clear, and it did not sound like any voice she had heard before. And so at first, Brenda just sat on the couch and didn't do anything and just waited, hoping that maybe she was just imagining this. But the voice in her head seemed to pick up on her reaction and said,
"Brenda, this is not a hallucination. We're real and we want to help you."
Brenda did not believe it was real. She believed she had just lost her mind. And so for the rest of the night, she just completely ignored the voice in her head, and first thing the next morning, she went to her doctor's office and said, "Please help me." The doctor referred her to a psychiatrist, and so she went over to the psychiatrist's office, and after they performed an evaluation of Brenda, they said, "Look, I don't really know why you're hearing these voices. There's no clear medical explanation for why." And so Brenda was ultimately diagnosed with something called functional hallucinatory psychosis, which basically means Brenda was hallucinating, but there was no clear reason why. The psychiatrist began treating Brenda with an antipsychotic drug as well as with supportive counseling. Over the next couple of weeks, as Brenda diligently took her medications and went to her appointments, the voices eventually stopped. And so Brenda went into her psychiatrist's office and she said, "Doc, you saved me. The voices are gone. I'm so happy." And the psychiatrist would later recall that Brenda was visibly relieved. It was obvious that she was not making this up, that she really believed that she had these voices and now they were gone. And so after Brenda left the office, she actually went on vacation with her family outside of London just to celebrate the fact that she had not, in fact, lost her mind. But while she was away on holiday, she started hearing the voices again. And this time, they told her she had to get back to London as soon as possible because there was something terribly wrong with her. And they gave her a very specific street address that she was supposed to go to seek treatment. And so Brenda is horrified that the voices are back in the first place, but what she's really scared about is that maybe there's some truth to what these voices are telling me. Maybe there is something wrong with her. And so Brenda ran to her husband and she explained what happened, and he was very reassuring and said, "Look, honey, You should just totally ignore the voices again. There's probably nothing wrong with you. Just try to relax and have a nice vacation. But Brenda could not relax. She could not ignore the voices because they were constantly telling her,
You need to leave. You need to go back. There's something wrong with you.
and so finally, Brenda convinced her family to end the vacation early, and they headed back to London. And as soon as they got there, Brenda made her husband come with her, and they drove to the street address the voices had given her. And when they got to this very specific location, they found themselves standing in front of the brain scan unit of a London hospital. Brenda and her husband were totally shocked, but before they could even react to what they were looking at, the voices in Brenda's head came back, and they told her,
You need to go inside and you need to request a brain scan for 2 reasons. 1, there's a tumor in your brain. And 2, this tumor is causing your brainstem to swell.
At this point, Brenda was so scared that this information might actually be true that despite what her husband was saying, she went right inside the brain scan unit and she requested the scan. And when they asked her, who's the doctor that referred you over here, she said, I don't have one. And she ultimately told them that, well, there are voices in my head that told me to come over here and get this scan. Now, the doctors at the brain scan facility were not totally like, get out of here. But instead, they said, look, this is a very expensive scan. We can't just let you in here and get a scan because the voices told you to. We need a clinical reason to do it. We need a doctor's note saying you need this scan. And so they turned Brenda away, and Brenda now is just a complete wreck. She ends up calling her psychiatrist, and she explains the situation about getting this address and being told to get this brain scan. And after a few minutes of hearing her story, her psychiatrist says, okay, you know what? I will call over and I will get you an appointment to get a brain scan because I want you to be at ease, and it seems like this is probably the only way we're going to be able to do that. And so after this conversation, the psychiatrist got in touch with this hospital and he requested the brain scan for Brenda. And about a month later, Brenda went in, she had the scan done, and sure enough, she had a brain tumor and her brainstem was swollen. The doctors couldn't believe it because Brenda was showing absolutely no signs of having this condition. And so they told her that, well, you can just wait and see what happens. This might not have any effect on you. And so you can just wait to see if you get symptoms eventually, or we can go in and do the surgery and remove this tumor. But of course, doing brain surgery comes with some very significant risks. After thinking it over with her family, Brenda decided to go with immediate surgery. And after telling her doctors as much, the voices in her head told her that she had made the right decision. A couple of days later, Brenda went in and her surgery was a huge success. After she regained consciousness in the recovery room, the voices spoke to her. They said,
We are pleased to have helped you. Goodbye.
After that, Brenda never heard the voices ever again, and she never had any complications from the surgery or from the tumor. And to this day, the medical community still has no idea who those voices in her head really were. Michael Packard might be the luckiest or unluckiest person alive. In 2001, when Michael was 38 years old, he was on a flight over Costa Rica when the small plane he was on crashed. The pilot, co-pilot, and a passenger were all killed on impact, but Michael and the 4 other passengers, they survived the crash, but they were all left badly injured and stranded in a very remote section of the jungle. The survivors attempted to use the downed plane's radio equipment to send out a distress signal to try to get someone to come out and help them, but they had no way of knowing if anybody was receiving their signal. And so all they could do was just send it out and then wait and hope somebody found them before they all died. And sure enough, 48 hours after crashing, rescuers were able to hack their way deep into the jungle where Michael and the other survivors were, and they were all saved. While Michael was recovering in the hospital, a doctor told him that based on his injuries, he would not have survived another night out in that jungle. The chances of even being in a plane crash are astronomically low. The odds are about 1 in 5 million, with some places giving odds as low as 1 in 20 million. To put that in perspective, Michael was far more likely to have been struck by lightning, which is about a 1 in 1 million chance, than he was to have been in that plane crash. But that plane crash would not be the last time that Michael defied the odds and did something totally unbelievable. Over the next couple of decades, Michael, who was a commercial diver by trade, would survive not 1, but 2 significant encounters with great white sharks off the coast of California. Some of Michael's friends would not be so lucky. Michael would get lost at sea, like really lost, like treading out in the middle of the ocean with no land in sight for hours lost. but miraculously, a boat would find him and save him again. And Michael would discover the body of a long-time missing person hidden underneath the water about 60 feet down off the coast of Massachusetts. But of all the improbable exploits of Michael's life, none is more unbelievable than what happened to him in 2021, which experts are saying he had about a 1 in 1 trillion chance of experiencing. On the morning of June 11th, 2021, Michael, who was 57 years old at the time, hopped in a boat with his longtime diving partner, Josiah. Once they were all situated and they had all their equipment inside of the boat, they took off and headed for the open waters right off the coast of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where they planned to do some lobster diving. A popular way to retrieve lobsters is to literally just dive down and by hand pick them up and bring them back to the surface. And so that day, that's what Michael and Josiah planned to do. Once they reached this spot right off the coast, Michael put on all of his scuba diving equipment and hopped in the water. Josiah did not put on any diving equipment because he was not going to be getting in the water for this dive. Instead, he would remain on the boat and help Michael get in and out of the water. He'd pull lobsters up onto the boat, and he was also there in case of an emergency, he could call for help. And so just after 6 a.m., once Michael was in the water and signaled he was good to go, he dove down below, and after a little while, he came back up, but with a relatively small haul of lobsters. And so the two men figured that, well, I guess today is just not a great day for catching lobsters. But regardless, for the next couple of hours, Michael continued to go down and catch as many lobsters as he possibly could. By 8 a.m., Michael had captured approximately 100 pounds of lobsters that were now in the boat. And so Michael and Josiah were actually starting to feel pretty good about this particular trip. And so Michael decided he would go back down one more time and try to get just a few more lobsters before they called it a day. And so Josiah remembers watching Michael, who was in the water, as he put his mouthpiece back in. He signaled up to Josiah that he was good to go. And Josiah watched as he disappeared below the surface. The water was very calm, and Josiah is just kind of scanning out across the water. And then all of a sudden, this eruption of white water came rushing up to the surface, right where Michael had gone down below. And so right away, Josiah leaned out over the edge of the boat to see if he could look down and see his friend. But he didn't see Michael anywhere. Instead, he saw something massive moving around underneath them. After Michael had broken the surface on this final dive down to get more lobsters, his plan was to sink down to the bottom of the ocean at about 60 feet and then go hunting for lobsters. But when he had descended to about 45 feet, he felt something smash into him from behind that felt like a truck hitting him, and then everything around him went totally pitch black. The impact of whatever it was that hit him had caused his mouthpiece to get blown out of his mouth. So he doesn't have air, and he starts fumbling around to find his mouthpiece, but he can't find it. And as he's fumbling around, his hands are making contact with what feels like walls all around him. He was inside of an enclosed space. But when he had touched these walls, they were not normal walls. They were soft, but they were hard at the same time, and they seemed to be moving, like they were pulsating or quivering. The space he was in was fairly large, and it was not completely flooded with water. It was like Michael had slipped into this air pocket. But this air pocket was not stationary. It was moving, and pretty fast, because the water that was inside of it was violently sloshing all around. Michael could hear it slapping up against the walls. As Michael continued to panic and fumble around for his mouthpiece, he started to notice intense pressure on his legs, but he had no idea what was causing it, and because it's pitch black, he couldn't see what it was. Finally, Michael found the line that was connected to his mouthpiece. He jammed it in his mouth, and he took a long inhale, and now that he could breathe again, he had this horrifying thought. Have I been swallowed by a shark? He instinctively began feeling around for the shark's teeth, but there were no teeth inside of this space. Instead, it was just these walls that continued to shift and move all around him, and that's when it dawned on him. He had been swallowed, but not by a shark. He had been swallowed by a whale. For nearly 45 seconds, Michael was trapped inside the closed mouth of a humpback whale. Despite their enormous size, they can be up to 60 feet long and weigh up to 70,000 pounds, they only eat small fish. So when this particular whale realized Michael was not a tiny fish, it began violently swinging its head side to side to try to dislodge Michael, and that caused that eruption of white water to go to the surface that Josiah saw. And after a few good shakes, Michael was spat out of this whale's mouth. Michael remembers suddenly being in the open water with enough light coming down that he could see around him. The water was very turbulent and churning, and he recalled as he made his way to the surface, looking straight down and seeing the tail fin of this enormous whale swimming away from him. Michael made his way to the surface and he flagged down Josiah, who boated over to him. He pulled him back into the boat, and Michael, who was totally traumatized by what happened, could only say to Josiah that he was inside of it and that it tried to eat him. After Josiah brought Michael back to shore and called the authorities, Michael was rushed to a hospital where he was evaluated, and unbelievably, he suffered really no injuries. He had some significant bruising to his legs where the whale had actually clamped down on him. That was the pressure he felt in his legs. The mouth of the whale was closing on his legs. But besides that, there really wasn't any other injuries. And so later that day, he was discharged. It's believed the whale was a juvenile that had been seen in the area that was about 30 to 35 feet long, and it had just accidentally scooped Michael up. The whale was certainly not trying to hurt Michael. Whales, especially humpback whales, are not in the business of hurting people. But in this exchange with Michael, Michael could have very easily died. He could have drowned or suffocated inside the mouth of this whale, or he could have just died from blunt force trauma. But luckily he didn't. Despite how terrifying this incident sounds, Michael was incredibly casual in all of his interviews about this. He just kind of acted like, yeah, these things kind of happen, whales come out of nowhere, they just scoop you up, it happens. And he would tell the incredulous reporters who just could not believe this guy was real that as soon as he was better, he was getting back in the water and going lobster diving. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comment section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please ask the like button if you can have a bite of their sandwich. When they say yes, proceed to take the biggest bite you possibly can. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you're interested in buying Mr. Ballin merchandise, like this flannel, like this hat, you can go to our shop by going to our Instagram page called Shop Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. I also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballin Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
For the ones who get it done, the most important part is the one you need now. And the best partner is the one who can deliver. That's why millions of maintenance and repair pros trust Grainger, because we have professional-grade supplies for every industry, even hard-to-find products. And we have same-day pickup and next-day delivery on most orders. But most importantly, we have an unwavering commitment to help keep you up and running. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace all of the like button's Windex with olive oil. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In January of 2015, a 27-year-old Texas man named George Pickering III suffered a massive stroke. He was immediately admitted to a hospital where he was put on life support, and then doctors delivered some bad news to his family. It would turn out George was brain dead, and they advised the family that realistically they should consider pulling George off of life support because it wasn't going to do him any good. George's family was totally devastated by this news. In fact, George's father was so upset he just left the hospital altogether. And so in his father's absence, George's mother and brother wound up talking to doctors and saying that yes, we are prepared to pull George off of life support. After they consented to have this done, they put George on an organ donor list and then began making funeral plans. When George's father came back to the hospital later that day and found out his family had consented to have George pulled from life support, he was furious. He did not believe his son was just totally brain dead and there was no hope. He felt like they should at least try to give him a little bit more time to potentially give them a signal that he was okay. But George's mother and brother told George's father that they had spoken to the doctors and there was just no hope. There was no reason to delay this process. It was time. But George's father was totally not having it. He stormed out of the room and he found the doctors and he demanded they keep his son on life support just a little bit longer. But the doctors told him there really is no reason to do that. And in fact, all you're doing is jeopardizing the people that need his organs, that are waiting for this organ transplant. And so really what we need to do is actually expedite taking him off of life support, because that's the best thing to do right now. George's father was so upset, totally distraught. He ran back to his son's room. He laid over his son and he just held his hands and stared at him and just prayed that his son would give him some sign that he was actually not brain dead, but his son didn't.